Kia ora koutou and welcome. Welcome to Module 2 of the Government Health and Safety Lead's Mentally Healthy Work Development Program. This module is about managing psychosocial risk. I'm Philip Voss, a partner at Leading Safety. We support New Zealand and Australian organisations wanting to strengthen their health and safety governance, leadership and culture, and we've done a good deal of work in the area of mentally healthy work, often in conjunction with the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. Before we get started, I want to reiterate a few key points from Module 1. In the Health and Safety at Work Act, the term health is defined to mean physical and mental health. Accordingly, your obligation to protect the mental health of kaimahi, workers, and others affected by your organisation's activities is no different to your obligation to protect their physical safety. In other words, your obligation is to design work that is mentally healthy as well as physically safe. According to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state of well-being in which people can cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively, and contribute to their communities. ISO 45003, the international standard for managing psychosocial risks, defines well-being at work as the fulfillment of the physical, mental, and cognitive needs and expectations of a worker related to their work. Well-being exists on a continuum from thriving to going okay to struggling to unwell. And finally, well-being is universal. All of us have it, all of the time. It's holistic. It integrates all aspects of a person's well-being, the physical, mental, social, and spiritual. It's subjective. The experience of one individual may not reflect that of another, and it's dynamic. Your well-being status can change from hour to hour, day to day, and so on. And that's where we'll pick up the story in this module. The main topics we'll cover are psychosocial hazard identification and risk management, psychosocial risk assessment, developing and implementing controls to manage psychosocial hazards, assessing the effectiveness of those controls, and finally, how to design work that is mentally healthy as well as physically safe. A hazard is any source of potential harm. This includes physical hazards, for example machinery, ergonomic hazards, for example poor workstation setup, chemical hazards, for example toxic substances, biological hazards, for example infectious microorganisms, or psychosocial hazards, for example work overload. Risk, on the other hand, refers to the likelihood and severity of harm occurring as a result of exposure to a hazard. Before we move on, it's worth noting a few things. Psychosocial risk is not a single generic risk. There are many specific work factors that have the potential to cause mental harm. Psychosocial risks are present in all types of work. Finally, good work design doesn't simply concern itself with protecting kaimahi from harm, but also builds in factors that will support them to thrive. Your organisation's legal obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act speak to the need to manage the psychosocial hazards and risks associated with work. Psychosocial work factors that can have a negative impact on well-being include things like unclear goals or expectations, unrealistic workload, inadequate rest and recovery time, difficult or destructive work relations, unfair or inconsistent treatment, and job insecurity. However, we should also be interested in identifying the work factors that enhance well-being, work factors that support folks to thrive. Examples include doing work that provides a sense of meaning and purpose, opportunities to learn and develop skills, recognition of contributions, and having supportive leaders and colleagues. The opportunity is to design into work and workplace environments as many of these factors as possible so that kaimahi are in a position to function to the best of their ability, to do great work and to contribute to getting after the outcomes that really matter to your organisation. If legal obligations can sometimes feel weighty, the opportunities these obligations create ought to feel uplifting and energising, and are likely to engage kaimahi in a much deeper, more meaningful way. This slide shows the mental health and wellbeing at work framework that my colleague Hilary Bennett developed for the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum in 2021. This is a sense-making framework that identifies 4 approaches to managing mental health and wellbeing at work. You'll notice the mental health continuum running vertically through the framework with a key and an entirely unsurprising colour scheme at the bottom. Moving clockwise, the 4 approaches to managing well-being are protect, foster, reclaim, and support. These approaches cover obligations, the 2 on the left, protect and support, and opportunities, the 2 on the right, foster and reclaim, and being proactive, the upper 2, protect and foster, and reactive, the lower 2, reclaim and support. There are several benefits to using a framework like this. It helps organisations manage mental well-being in a strategic way. It aligns initiatives with their mental health continuum, and it provides a basis to map your organisation's existing wellbeing initiatives as a kind of gap analysis. In what areas are you doing well? Where could you do more? Where might you be exposed? There are 3 main points I'd like to make here. The first is that an effective wellbeing strategy incorporates all 4 approaches. Is your organisation adequately covering these bases? The second is that the protect approach focuses on the work and the design of that work, whereas the other 3 approaches focus on the worker. Lastly, it's important to note that the protect approach is about more than psychosocial risk assessment. In other words, identifying the psychosocial risks associated with work, although that's clearly a necessary initial step. The idea is to design work in such a way as to eliminate or minimize those risks. In other words, to prevent harm from occurring in the first place, while also investing in the protective work factors that support folks to thrive. At a high level, the approach to managing psychosocial risks is no different to the way we go about managing physical safety in our workplaces. As a result, many of the disciplines that serve us well in a safety context will also prove their worth when it comes to managing well-being at work. Whereas organisations usually take a strategic approach to matters of physical safety, they don't always do so when it comes to well-being. The initiatives in place are almost certainly well-intentioned, but are oftentimes ad hoc, reactive, and not sufficiently connected to the specific psychosocial hazards associated with work. Instead, taking the risk-based approach we're all familiar with, we'll identify the psychosocial risks associated with the work kaimahi do, and then put in place measures to eliminate or minimise those risks. There are a number of ways to identify the psychosocial hazards in your workplace. This slide gives a variety of ways you can go about doing this, from understanding the nature of the work, to asking kaimahi, to reviewing available data and information, to directly observing work. The key is for leaders to be curious about the work that kaimahi do. Take any and all opportunities to find out as much as you can about the work factors that have the potential to cause harm, as well as those that can enhance well-being. Having identified the work-related psychosocial hazards, our attention then moves to assessing the risk of harm associated with those hazards. A psychosocial risk assessment will provide insights into the likelihood and the potential consequences of exposure to any particular psychosocial hazard that has been identified in your workplace. As we've seen, psychosocial hazards can include stresses like high workload, tight deadlines, and interpersonal conflict. The risk of harm associated with these stresses depends on factors like workload management, communication channels, support systems, and organisational culture. For example, if employers implement flexible work arrangements, provide stress management training, and foster a supportive work environment, the risk of stress-related problems like anxiety or burnout is reduced. However, if work demands are consistently high, communication is poor, and there's a lack of support, the risk of stress-related issues increases. One of the challenges when it comes to managing well-being, and one way it differs from the way we manage physical safety, is that different people are likely to experience a particular psychosocial work factor differently. If you think about it, that's generally not the case when it comes to physical safety. The energy associated with physical hazards is governed by physics, not personality. Take falling from height as an example. If you and I both stumble unharnessed from the same scaffolding platform, then two things will be true. First, we'll both fall to the ground, and secondly, gravity will operate on us in the same way. A third thing's also probably true. It's going to hurt. By contrast, consider the psychosocial impact of a demanding, time-bound work project that requires our team to keep our noses to the grindstone for weeks on end, with the pressure and scrutiny ramping up as we approach the looming deadline. Perhaps you find this situation motivating and energizing in a way that brings out the best in your performance, and afterwards leaves you feeling a strong sense of accomplishment and looking forward to the next challenge that will test you. However, I find the exact same situation chaotic, stressful, and eventually overwhelming. If I stay with the project to its conclusion, and that might be a big if, I leave it feeling burned out and taken advantage of. I find the whole thing really unpleasant. These different experiences may be explained by a whole host of factors, including our skill sets, our personalities, what else is going on in our respective lives at the time, our stages of life, and so on. The point is, you can't assume that everyone will have the same experience of psychosocial work factors. On a positive note, you know the folks who are the experts in all of this. They're your staff. Kaimahi are the experts in the work they do, as well as the psychosocial impacts of that work. So, consult with them to understand how and under what conditions a particular psychosocial hazard presents in your workplace, how effectively you're managing the risk associated with that hazard, and to generate ideas for how you can manage the risk even more effectively. The Health and Safety at Work Act requires organisations to eliminate risks to health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable. And if it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate risks to health and safety, to minimise those risks so far as is reasonably practicable. So, how do we make sense of controls to eliminate or minimise psychosocial risks? This diagram will be familiar to most in that it shows the well-known hierarchy of controls that ranks controls from most effective, elimination, at the top, to least effective, personal protective equipment, at the bottom. Undoubtedly, you've encountered this hierarchy in the context of physical hazards, such as working at height, loss of separation with vehicles or moving plant, or perhaps arc flash from high voltage electrical systems. The point is that you need to consider and implement the most effective controls possible to manage a given hazard. You may also have heard the distinction above the line versus below the line controls in that context. The line that's being referred to is the dotted horizontal line running between isolation and administrative controls in this diagram. It's generally considered inadequate to control a critical physical safety risk, that is, where there's a possibility of serious harm or worse occurring, using below-the-line controls alone. However, below-the-line controls can nicely complement one or more above-the-line controls. You'll see the right-hand section of this diagram is an adaptation of the standard hierarchy to consider ways to control psychosocial hazards. In that context, there's an equivalent above-the-line, below-the-line distinction, that of changing the work versus changing the worker. As was the case with physical risks, our view is that it's inadequate to control a critical psychosocial risk using change the worker controls alone. It's first important to consider what change the work controls are available and reasonably practicable to implement. As noted just then, having identified and assessed a psychosocial risk, we must first look to eliminate that risk so far as is reasonably practicable. If elimination is not possible, then we must look to minimise the risk so far as is reasonably practicable. Then, and only then, do we consider how we can support the worker. Let's work through this process with reference to some practical examples. The first example for us to consider is exposure to violence and aggression in the workplace. Violence and aggression can take many forms, ranging from physical assault, robberies, and verbal abuse, to intimidation and low-level threatening behaviour. Lone workers, particularly those working night shifts, may be at increased risk of violence and aggression, where some work tasks are more challenging to do alone. First, you must always eliminate the risk where you're reasonably able to do so. Examples of this are installing physical barriers and implementing remote customer support. Where the risk can't be eliminated, you need to consider what you can do to minimise it. Examples of this are instituting a policy on customer behaviour, increasing staff numbers, providing security guards, and de-escalation training. Having taken whatever steps you can to eliminate or minimise this risk, then consider how you can support the worker who has experienced violence or aggression. Examples of this are providing alternative duties and accessing psychological support. The main point here is that you need to select the most effective controls that are proportionate to the risk and appropriate to your work situation. The next example to consider is exposure to distressing, traumatic, and/or sensitive content in the workplace. Distressing content may include imagery, stories, and other material related to serious incidents, such as gathering or reading victim testimonies of natural disasters, injury, abuse, or neglect, or exposure to material that brings up traumatic memories. Increasingly, those in online or community moderation roles are seen as working on the digital frontline, and we need to consider how to keep these folks safe, healthy, and happy in a tough, often confronting job. Content is more likely to be distressing when it is unexpected, seems out of one's control, or is caused by intentional cruelty. Distressing content certainly becomes a hazard when it is severe, prolonged, or frequent. Again, the slide outlines the level of control you should consider when it comes to managing distressing content, as well as examples of possible controls at those different levels. The final example we'll look at relates to work overload, and it's a growing phenomenon, with technology increasingly blurring the boundary between work and personal life. In the digital age, kaimahi can, if we don't recognise the risk and put controls in place, find themselves always on, constantly responding to email or phone calls and dealing with a heavy workload in what can feel like 24/7. Kaimahi who work 60 hours or more a week are at higher risk of burnout. Long hours, excessive tasks, lack of clarity, or short deadlines can all add up to unmanageable workload. Left unaddressed, work overload can contribute to employee burnout, which the World Health Organization defines as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Burnout is characterized by three dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. Again, the slide outlines the levels of control you should consider when it comes to managing work overload, as well as examples of possible controls at these different levels. Here's a real-world instance of work overload leading to burnout. This slide outlines a recent, well-publicised Employment Relations Authority decision that addresses an employer's obligations where an employee raises mental health concerns, in this case concerns about burnout as a result of an unreasonable workload. The authority found that the employee concerned, who eventually resigned, citing a breach of his employment agreement and injury sustained due to burnout, had been constructively dismissed and awarded him almost $50,000 in compensation and lost wages. This decision demonstrates the importance of acting promptly when an employee raises concerns about burnout or mental ill health more generally. Employers have a positive obligation to properly investigate the causes of a mental health condition if it may be related to the work environment and ensure they take proactive steps to understand what is causing the issue and what is required to address it. As an aside, it's interesting to note that this action was taken under the Employment Relations Act and not also under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Under the latter, as we've discussed, organisations have a duty to provide a working environment that is physically and mentally safe. Had there been evidence of a systematic pattern of harm experienced by multiple employees, perhaps this might have come into play. Just as it's good practice to periodically review the effectiveness of the controls you have in place to manage physical safety risks, the same is true of the controls for psychosocial risks. What might trigger such a review? Well, the slide gives you some ideas. Any of these would signal it's a good time to review the effectiveness of your psychosocial controls and make whatever improvements you can to those controls. While everyone has a role to play in creating a mentally healthy workplace, I want to reiterate the vital role played by leaders. Ultimately, mental well-being at work is a leadership issue. Leaders who allow a toxic workplace environment to emerge are breaching both their legal and ethical duties. What's more, in failing to take effective action, they are also compromising their organisation's ability to get after the outcomes that really matter to it. If attention is the currency of leadership, then leading well-being requires paying attention to the complex challenge of designing, organising and managing mentally healthy work, all while running an organisation that undoubtedly faces many other pressing demands. Leaders need to focus on work design, not just on fixing people. Question how things have always been done. Be curious about how things can be done differently. Be courageous to make the necessary changes, and be patient to allow those changes to embed. If you say it fast, maybe that sounds straightforward. It isn't. On that, here's a question. As a senior leader committed to protecting the well-being of kaimahi and navigating all of this complexity, who's looking after your well-being? If you cast your mind back once again to our 4-quadrant mental health and wellbeing at work framework, recall I said that the PROTECT approach is more than psychosocial risk assessment, and that the idea is to design work to eliminate or minimise those risks while also investing in the protective work factors that help folks thrive. On this slide, I'm sharing Leading Safety's process for doing just that. Better Work by Design puts the emphasis where it ought to be, on the work rather than on the worker. The process involves engaging kaimahi, either face-to-face or online, to design their work in a way that 1. Enables them to thrive, 2. Provides the highest level of protection from physical and mental harm, and 3. Puts the organisation in a position to succeed. Before we leave this slide, I'd like to spotlight one critical success factor, not only for the Better Work by Design process, but more generally for doing work in the wellbeing space. The need to foster sufficient psychological safety to make it possible to have open, honest conversations about work. There's a growing body of support and guidance resources for leaders wishing to know more about the management of psychosocial risk, some of which are listed here. I encourage you to take advantage of these resources as you continue your journey to become leaders of mentally healthy workplaces. One final reminder to the officers out there. One of your due diligence obligations is to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. Being curious about mentally healthy work and engaging with this video series and the related resources is a great way to build your knowledge and meet this obligation. The main topics we've covered in this module are psychosocial hazard identification and risk management, psychosocial risk assessment, developing and implementing controls to manage psychosocial hazards, assessing the effectiveness of those controls, and how to design work that is mentally healthy as well as physically safe. If you take just one idea away from this module, and I hope that you take many, let it be this: mentally healthy work is a matter of design, not luck. So thanks for giving this important topic your attention, and thanks for your commitment as leaders to creating mentally healthy work and mentally healthy workplaces.